Hey everybody, it's Matt Nelson here once again with Jared Zimmer of the Word on Fire Institute, and we're back for another episode of the Evangelization and Culture Show. Today we're going to be listening to an interview that Jared recently did with Dr. Arthur Brooks, and it's a good one, so you're going to like it. It was a big highlight for you, Jared, when you did that interview, wasn't it?
It was. Dr. Brooks has really been kind of a bit of a hero for me. I actually was originally aware of his work because Bishop Barron had mentioned knowing him, and actually they went to lunch together, I believe, whenever Bishop Barron was over near, when Dr. Brooks was part of the American Enterprise Institute. He was the president there for a little over a decade. He's now a professor at Harvard, but he had just mentioned the name, and so I started kind of doing some research and figuring out who Dr. Brooks was. And I found that his expression, I do have an interest in politics, economics, et cetera, but I'm certainly no expert by any means. But he was able to express both the science of economics as well as Catholic social teaching in a very clear, concise way. Oftentimes whenever it comes to these subjects like Catholic social teaching or economics, obviously you have the church's teachings, the magisterial documents talking about how the church understands these things. But in its practical application, there is some disagreement involved. And I found that Dr. Brooks is able to really balance what he calls the economics of the heart, right? Of understanding economics, the science of it, in regard to being a tool to carry out what's best for society. And the way to do that is to understand the worldview through the Catholic social teaching and to implement those things into our economic structures. So during this interview, we actually, in large part, we discussed his latest book there, Love Your Enemies. And in large part, we talk about not only the economics of the heart, but also this idea of what we kind of mentioned about in the first episode, which is this culture of contempt. And I think that Arthur is able to, once again, kind of offer a third way whenever we're talking about the problems of the culture of contempt. Mm-hmm. And I know you had mentioned that was something that really stuck out to you when it comes to Dr. Brooks.
Yeah, we talked about this third way in the first episode of the Evangelization Culture Show that we did. And it was really interesting for me to sit back and listen to what Dr. Brooks had to say because, like I had mentioned before, I had never heard of him before and I wasn't familiar with his work. And if I was being perfectly honest, economics isn't something that I'm usually really excited to talk about or learn about. And so one of the things that you encouraged me to do in order to become more familiar with his work was to check out a Netflix documentary that's available right now that he created or produced or whatever, but it's based off of his work and what he's doing worldwide and the influence he's having worldwide. And I was watching the documentary and he's sitting down with the Dalai Lama and he's discussing his ideas, and I'm thinking this is not a man of small ideas. Mm-hmm. He's got big ideas. He's clearly got a big intellect, and yet he's advocating for this economics of the heart. Yeah. And when you hear somebody talk about an economics of the heart or an apologetics of the heart or evangelization from the heart, or when we hear this heart, this idea of the heart being offered, we often think of some kind of emotional or sentimental way of doing things. But that's properly understood, at least in Dr. Brooks's context, that's not what he meant at all. Do you want to talk a little bit about what he means by an economics of the heart?
Yeah, really, it's a way of integrating what he calls Matthew 28 Christianity, which is a matter of upholding human dignity along with understanding the responsibilities we have. So during the interview, we actually discussed a little bit of the fact that in an economic structure, you have both the need to help the poor and the lowly and those who need the help the most, but then at the same time, you have the responsibility aspect of it, of working hard and understanding work as part of your human dignity. And so he balances those two with this idea of the economics of the heart, that it's not this kind of cold, dislocated science, that it's only about the bottom dollar. In fact, I think he would argue against the idea of just the bottom dollar brass tacks type of thing. It's like, we'll know what's best for human dignity as well as what's best for the culture and best for our economic structures. And so it's kind of he calls it economics of the heart, but it's really an economics of the brain and the heart, right?
Yeah.
It's not to dislocate from the brain, but it's to operate with both in a charitable unity going together.
Well, let me throw an idea at you, something that I was just thinking of as you were talking, which we're not supposed to be thinking about what we're going to say next when we're listening to each other, as the professionals of active listening tell us. But you struck an idea with me that I want to bounce off you. So if we're talking about this third way, which is what Dr. Arthur Brooks would refer to as the way of love, and we're using that as our central tenet of how we do economics, say. Well, love then, as you just said, is not just an act of the will, but in a way we could see it as also an act of the intellect. This is the way I understand that, is to love somebody, St. Thomas Aquinas says, is to will the good of the other. But then one of the questions that we have to ask is, well, what is the other? Because the good of the other will depend on what it is or who it is. Not that who it is going to, in some way, determine that one person is treated with more dignity than another.
Right.
All human beings have equal dignity, and that's what Revelation tells us. But understanding who we're speaking to, but also what it is that we're engaging, will then determine what's the good for that. So, for example, if it's the good. In my relationship with you, there's going to be certain goods that I'm going to seek to realize with you that are going to be different from, say, with my wife or from another coworker or for a friend. Depending on who somebody is in terms of their relationship with me, that's going to also determine what the goods are that I'm going to try to realize for them. And so to will the good of the other also involves an act of the intellect where we come to know who it is that we're seeking to know and to love, and to recognize that all human beings have equal dignity, and that even with the lowest of the low, as a figure of speech, even with the poorest of the poor, even with those who are in the prisons, people who we might be tempted to see as like subhuman in some way, to realize that these are all our brothers and sisters in the Lord. That's key for this economics of the heart, I think Dr. Brooks would say.
Yeah, and I think that requires two things. One is it requires a metaphysics of the human person. So what is the human person? What's his teleology? What's his ontology? And whenever you get that wrong, you might get your economic structure wrong, because if he's just a means to an end, or he ends up becoming just a cog in the wheel, as we've seen in some economic systems, then it downgrades the human person, right? But that's because you're operating on a metaphysics of the human person being something, nothing more than perhaps, an intelligent ape, or something like that. But then there's also, and I think Dr. Brooks does such a good job of this, is he says that not all societies require the same economic structure. Some economic structures might work better in other cultures because the culture operates differently, and so he does advocate for a free market economy because the science of it shows how many millions of people have come up and out of poverty over the past 30 years, and I think we actually mentioned that in this part of the interview. But it is to say that there is also a recognition of the human person, but also of the culture itself. How does it operate, and in what ways is this economic structure going to help or harm this place? So you can't just come in and say, we've got this structure and we're going to place it in your midst, and you have to operate out of it. And so in that way too, it's recognizing the dignity of these different cultures as well. So it's the human person as well as the larger culture itself. But yeah, for this interview, I guess now we'll go right into it. And just a quick caveat. This is actually a portion of a longer interview that I did with Dr. Brooks. Here we talk specifically more about the culture of contempt, the economic structures, et cetera. But later on in the interview, we actually discuss his conversion to Catholicism, as well as a few mystical experiences that he's had and his personal spirituality. And so in order to get that second aspect of it, or the longer interview, you'll have to be a member of the Word on Fire Institute. But Matt, I don't know if we want to just go right into the interview.
Yeah, let's jump into it. And I just want to say, too, I was fascinated by what Dr. Arthur Brooks talked about in regard to anger and how he understands anger and how that applies to this topic of economics and loving even our enemies, as he puts it in his book. So let's move on to the interview with Jared and Dr. Arthur Brooks.
Yeah.
Well, there's a few things I really wanted to bring you on to chat with you about today, and of course, the first being economics. I mean, that's what you got your PhD in, and I've read through so much of your material, and I've watched a lot of the YouTube stuff that's available, and throughout it, you continue to give kind of a clarion call for an economics of the heart, if you will. What do you mean by that, and what does that kind of look like?
Well, we're in a time right now where economics is being hotly disputed by, between the right and the left, and, varieties of the right and varieties of the left. And, I guess there's probably never been a time when people didn't dispute economic principles, but it's a really hot ideological war at this point, and we're re-examining a lot of the things that we mostly accepted in the United States about free markets and about the nature of capitalism. And it's a funny time right now because we find that there are people on the left that call themselves sort of nationalistic conservatives, and a lot of Catholics, by the way, that they believe that the free enterprise system is broken, that it hurts communities, that it hurts people, it's inherently immoral. And people on the very hard political left believe the same thing. So it's funny. It's like the left and the right are kind of meeting around this antipathy toward capitalism. One of the things that I'd like to point out is that capitalism, or any ism for that matter, is a thing. It doesn't have inherent morality. It's a way that we express ourselves in commercial terms, or it's sort of downstream from our culture, and we can wreck anything. I mean, people think that capitalism is kind of selfish or makes people selfish. That's wrong. A lack of brotherly love, a lack of love for each other is what makes us selfish. And when we are not our brother's keeper, when we are not taking the gospel seriously, when we're not acting up to our highest aspirations as human beings, well, of course, capitalism is going to make it worse. Socialism makes it worse. Monarchism makes it worse. Everything makes it worse because these things they're accelerants to our own vice in this way. So one of the things that I try to tell people and share with people, no matter what their political ideology, is take care of your morals first. Take care of your heart. The love that you have for others, there's just no substitute. There's no economic substitute for that. And then we can make things better with a good system. One of the things that I'm very enthusiastic about is how the free enterprise system, and as instantiated in the American entrepreneurial system spreading around the world, has pulled 2 billion of my brothers and sisters out of poverty.
That's a staggering number.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
It's incredible, and it really was entrepreneurship and free enterprise and the culture of those things. But still, it's no substitute for love, and we can't be blinded to that. We can't be so ideological about that as to think that capitalism is villain or on the opposite side of the coin, that it's going to save us. It never will. It can make things better, but we have to do the serious work of the heart first.
Yeah, so it seems to me that what it focuses in on, and this is what the church teaches as well, is an economic structure that's built around human dignity. Right, that it's around the individual and what's best for the individual, and so the church teaching would be that work is a good thing, that it actually builds the dignity of the individual, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, work is. It's interesting. People often think that, in the story of Genesis, that Adam and Eve got kicked out and had to go to work. Well, no. I mean, before the fall, God said, "Work the garden." He didn't say, "Go relax in the garden." He said, "Work the garden." Why? Because work is the source of our sense of dignity. Now, as Christians, of course, and most people who are not Christians agree with us, that there's an inherent equality of human dignity, a radical equality of human dignity. That comes from the concept, of course, that we're made in God's image. Dignity, the definition of dignity is to be worthy of respect. God is worthy of respect. If we're made in God's image, therefore we are worthy of respect, which is to say, by definition, we have dignity, and we have equal human dignity. The problem is that we don't have an equal sense of human dignity. How can we work together such that people have an equal sense of the human dignity that is, in point of fact, equal? And the answer is for people to be needed in our society, to be needed in their communities, to be needed in their families. That's when you know that Jared is Jared and that Arthur is Arthur. That's my highest and best calling and use, is because I'm necessary. I can feel and see, I can smell and taste the dignity that I have around me it's funny, I have teenage kids, and they don't always like me, but they need me. and that's a huge source of dignity for me as a father. It's like, I have students, and always like me, but man, they need me even if they don't know it. And I'm needed in this way. Now, the reason that economics is really important, that work is really important, is because through work and this big thing that we do for at least a third of our lives, we can actually see evidence of our neededness. And as such, we can see evidence of our dignity, to give us the sense of dignity. And that links us to our Creator. The reason the church is so hot on the idea of meaningful, dignified work is because we need a daily reminder, day in and day out. By work, the church does not mean the factory in the field. The church means a human endeavor for value. That means taking care of your children. That means giving up your time charitably. It means doing something of actual value through your effort and through your endeavor. And so doing, you earn your success. And that's such a huge gift from God. When we forget that because of our ideology, when we say that, it's great for me to work, but I should actually have a safety net that makes it possible for some people never to work. Well, what we've said is that not everybody needs a reminder of their equal human dignity. And that's a form of discrimination that I think that we as Catholics shouldn't abide.
Now, when it comes to what I love about your work is it's so balanced when it comes to understanding economics, understanding the individual. And one thing that kind of came to my mind was, there's this balance between promoting self-reliance as well as promoting help when needed. And I think you've been so good at striking that balance. And so what makes that balance the kind of the moral structure that allows us to do both well?
Well, to begin with, we recognize that there are complementary needs that we have as people. Number one is, as I just talked about, is to be needed, such that we can sense our self-worth, earn our success, and understand our dignity, which is equal. The other is that we have an obligation to care for the least of these, our brothers and sisters. Now, the best way that we can care for the least of these, our brothers and sisters, to be Gospel of Matthew Christian is a Matthew 25:40 Christian, is to make sure that everybody can earn their success and live up to their equal dignity. I'm persuaded that if our blessed Lord were walking the earth today, he wouldn't just be talking about the naked and the hungry because these were basic needs at a time of an entirely different economies. He would say, and his disciples would say, "Lord, when did we see you unemployed?" And yeah. Because we have economies that are really different, but the needs are the same. And so to be a Matthew 5:44 Christian, 25:44 Christian requires that we look out for the neededness of our brothers and sisters, but also remembering these basic needs that are always present, that people are not hungry, that people are not cold, that people do have shelter. And so you need to find a balance between safety nets and self-reliance. And that's what we're always looking for. And we get it wrong sometimes. Sometimes the safety net will wind up infringing on self-reliance, and as such, it will degrade human dignity. And sometimes we'll be so hard over, he who does not work shall not eat, in St. Paul and his famous in Thessalonians, right? But to take that so literally that we'll basically say, you can sleep out on a subway grate if you can't find a job. Well, that's obviously wrong too. As Catholics, we're supposed to be reasonable, and we're supposed to balance these particular needs. But to neglect one in favor of the other is an inherently unbalanced approach.
Yeah, and I know you're a big proponent of the free market economy structure, and obviously, the $2 billion coming out of poverty is a great example of why it works. And you see in Rerum Novarum, Statissimus Annus, all of those that government regulation oftentimes ends up becoming problematic, and allowing a free market economy to thrive within, as you said, the moral balance there. But in your research and in your studies, and what is it about the free market that has been able to do this? Is there something inherent in it?
Yeah, no, there's actually nothing inherent. It requires, again, a basis in human morality. If people are immoral, if people cheat each other, if people don't have love for each other, then the free market doesn't work. It just doesn't, because the market will fail. It requires a certain level of social trust. It requires a society that believes in some amount of virtue. And that, by the way, Jared, is one of the reasons I believe that we've had so much trouble of late. We have a society in which we simply don't see ourselves enough as our brother's keeper. And as such, any system that we put in place, whether it be a system of democratic socialism like we see in Europe, or a more free market system that we would see in some places around the world like the United States, is not going to work as well. But that's because the underlying hardware isn't right. It's not because the software is running wrong. It's that the hardware doesn't know how to run the software right, and the hardware is the hardware of the heart, as it were. I guess I'm attenuating the metaphor here a little bit, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
So I think that I think that the free market system is phenomenal when in a country like the United States, where we have a lot of social trust and we have institutions, civic institutions like the Catholic Church, that are functioning. And one of the things that we need to do, whether we're economists or not, is see to these institutions and to see to this culture. Because in so doing, we can protect the free market system for lifting people up, giving people jobs, bringing people to their best use, making it possible for people to dream big dreams and do wonderful things. And if each of us doesn't look at the culture, doesn't look at the institutions, none of that's going to work.
Another aspect that I love is also in, I forget which video it was, or it was a speech you gave about economics and happiness, and how so oftentimes we tie our happiness to things like money, power, fame, sex, things like that. And I remember you brought up a research study that showed that even because as religious people, we would obviously see the issues there. But that from a research perspective, that when people answered those as their main objective, it ended up being the opposite.
Yeah, no, it's funny. So my main beat as a researcher, I'm a behavioral social scientist. My main beat is love and happiness. This is what I've done the most work on. And it's interesting that, just as a kind of a short course on happiness, I teach courses on happiness now, but just all you need to know is pretty simple. Half of your happiness is genetic, the happiness that you feel. By the way, I'm not speaking in an Aristotelian way here. It's like a good life well lived. I mean, I'm just talking about the happiness that we feel. I'm a simple man, right? About half of it is genetic, and we do this with studies on identical twins that were separated at birth, and it's wonderful research methods. And then the other half is split somewhere between circumstances and habits. And some people think it's really a lot with circumstances. Some people think it's more habits. But either way, they're kind of linked to each other, because when you have good habits, you get better luck, and so your circumstances improve. So the part that you got to pay attention to are the habits that are going to bring the happiest life. And you can boil it down to basically 4 things. And those 4 things are faith, family, friendship, and work. And the work has to have these things that we've already talked about. You have to be able to earn your success and achieve, and you have to serve others. That's it. I mean, that's what work has got to look like. And if you pay attention to faith, family, community, by which I mean friendships and serving, and work, where you serve others and you earn your success, you've got the best happiness portfolio that you can assemble. Now, it's interesting because as I was lecturing on this at the same time that I was really, really listening to a lot of Bishop Barron's work, and he's Thomistic. I mean, he's one of the nation's greatest experts on Aquinas, and he's got this. There's this place in the Summa Theologica where Aquinas says basically there are 4 substitutes for God. Anybody who's a Bishop Barron fanatic like me has heard Bishop Barron talk about this all the times. There are 4 substitutes for God. You know what they are, right, Jared?
Yes.
Money, power, pleasure, honor. Yep. And by honor, he doesn't mean like the good kind of honor in the military. He means fame, right? And for people in particular professions where you're not going to get famous, it's prestige, right? You want the people to think that you're kind of good. Pretty special, right? So money, power, pleasure, and fame. And so basically there's a kind of a symmetry here, isn't it? There's the virtuous 4, faith, family, friends, and work. And there's the bad 4, money, power, pleasure, fame. By that, I don't mean those things are inherently bad. It means attachment to those things is bad, right? And so you can basically, with remembering 8 things, you can do a lot of good in your life. The economics of happiness turns out to be, it's not simple because then you got to execute on it, but basically catch yourself from being attached with the vicious attachments to money, power, pleasure, and fame, and migrate those loves to God and to your family and to your friends and to serving others through your work. And you're on the way.
It seems to me like that's such a powerful means, especially to get the conversation started for, say, the evangelists that are watching this that want to become better evangelizers. That's something that speaks just universally. I mean, of course, it's empirical data based on your research, number one, but also just you go to the Buddhists or Muslims or Christians, and we all have some pretty basic universal needs for happiness. And then from there to grow, I think that's a great way for evangelists to get those conversations started.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the way to get people interested in what we're doing is to talk about the things that they want. It's
man desires to be happy.
Happiness is the aim and final end of man. Men and women, they want to be happy. And so talking about how to do that. Now, I talk an awful lot about love in my work because love is the nuclear fuel of happiness. Without love, happiness becomes largely irrelevant. And so you want to look at, how we're wired as people. And so I've been doing a lot of work on that of late, in particular because there's a love crisis in this country and indeed around the world. But also because, people key in, they just get really, really interested. So one of the pieces of advice that I give to people who are trying to evangelize, which is to say all of us, right? I mean, apostolate is every day. It's an everyday activity. And what greater privilege is there than to be, to evangelize through the way that we talk and think? Talk about these things. Talk about your own journey toward trying to be happier. Talk about something that you read that's really working for you. And it's astonishing to me, that now that I've, for years now, I've been doing this work on love and happiness, and people just tell me these incredible stories. And when I write about it, millions of people will read about it. And so that's been a cue for me that my personal apostolate is tied to my secular work.
Yeah. Now, I guess kind of the opposite of the issue of happiness that we're dealing with, maybe affecting happiness today, is something else that you write about in Love Your Enemies. Of course, the idea of culture of contempt. And something that we talk about a lot at Word on Fire, because we're a very social media based organization, and we hope people are evangelizing through social media as well. But there's a certain unhealthiness going on within social media, but also just the culture in general. But maybe just for our audience, if you could define what you mean by contempt, and what are some of those cultural pieces that are causing the problem.
Yeah, no, this is something I've been thinking about an awful lot, and I wrote a book that we published in March that you just referred to, called Love Your Enemies. Crazy idea, right? Whoever got, I don't know where I got that one. And it's funny, it's like people are so disconnected from just the cultural cues from the Bible. And I was giving a talk at a big university, and a kid comes up after me and says, Love Your Enemies. That's a great title. Where'd you get it? We need better education. So the culture of contempt, the first is, let me define contempt. People often say that there's too much anger in American politics and American life today. We're all angry with each other. And there is a lot of anger, to be sure. But anger is a hot cognition. It's a hot emotion. If you and I, if you get mad at me, it's almost certainly because you want me to do something differently, to think something different, or to act differently. That's good. That means you care what I do. And that caring is the essence of relationships between people. The healthy couples, they get angry with each other all the time. I mean, there's actually good studies that show that there's no correlation between divorce and anger in a marriage. And, as Bishop Barron knows well, because he knows my wife, I've been married for 28 years to a Spaniard, and the secret to my happy 28 years of marriage is the lack of correlation between anger and divorce. So the problem is when that hot cognition turns cold. So Arthur Schopenhauer, the great 19th century philosopher, he died in 1860, he defined contempt as the conviction of the utter worthlessness of another person. So basically when anger metastasizes by adding in another, so psychologists will often say you take anger and you mix in disgust with anger. Mix in disgust and it turns the hot emotion cold. And you become convicted that the person with whom you were previously angry is worthless. And when that person is worthless, you have a million cues to say you are worthless. There's nothing that will hurt another person more than saying you are worthless. And the greatest harm you can do is if you're a person who should love that other person. So when a spouse unwittingly gives cues that the other person is worthless, these are the leading indicators of divorce. There's a guy named John Gottman. He's a marriage psychologist. He's a social psychologist at the University of Washington in Seattle, and he's the world's leading expert on marital reconciliation. This guy's a hero. He's brought thousands of couples back together again. I mean, and he's a wonderful man. And he says that the leading indicator, he can meet a couple for an hour that he's never met before in counseling, and he can predict with 95+% accuracy if they'll be divorced within 3 years.
That's incredible.
I know. You want to know what he's looking for, right, Jared? He's looking for eye rolling. He's looking for sarcasm and derision and signs, other signs, physical signs of contempt. It's like, eye rolling. That means what you said is the stupidest thing I've ever heard, which is a sign of dismissiveness. It says you're worthless, what you think is worthless, and that is injurious to the other person. And so what he does, here's the good news that he comes up with. He finds that most couples that are talking about getting divorced, they still love each other. The problem is that they're unwittingly acting like they hate the other person through these signs of contempt. So what he has to do is he has to re-engineer the way that they talk to each other. Now, our culture today, our political culture, our social media culture is like a really terrible marriage where we're treating each other with this unbelievable derision and contempt. We're dismissing each other. We're acting as if it's the stupidest thing you've ever heard. We're giving and taking offense at the smallest things. We're not trying to understand each other. We're treating each other as utterly worthless. And that culture of contempt is really what's ripping us apart. The answer to that for each one of us is to do what Gottman would say if you and your wife were bitterly fighting and on your way to divorce court. He would make you start acting, catching yourself when you're about to treat your partner with contempt. And you wouldn't do it, and love would return. And so each one of us can do that. And one of the things I talk about in Love Your Enemies is it's a manual. This is not a philosophical book. I'm just, I'm a simple social psychologist or simple social scientist. And one of the things that I talk about is, the things that each one of us can do to fight contempt personally and therefore bring more love and guaranteed to stir up more love in our hearts and to make each one of us happier, whether it works or not.
Yeah, and one of those rules that I found to be a bit of a challenge, I think, especially whenever it comes to social media, is the 5-to-1 rule. And so I think especially whenever it comes to social media, that we're so quick to just always lambast people, and that's it. To find positive messages or comments about individuals is a pretty rare thing.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy. So let's define the 5-to-1 rule for the people watching this video. So John Gottman, the psychologist I was talking about before, he says that when a couple can't get along, they're usually very late in the relationship and they can't think of anything loving to say about the other person. It's weird. Like when you're remember when you're first in love and you literally couldn't think of any criticisms? Right. like criticize someone about it. It's like, I don't know. It's like she's beautiful and she's funny and she's smart and she's nice. And when a couple is about ready to break up, it's like she's late all the time and she's mean to me and I think she hates me and so what he does is he re-engineers their communication. The way that he does that is he makes couples carry around these 2 notebooks. And when they want to lay into each other, say something sarcastic or bitter or negative, they write it down. And then he says they have to say like 5 nice things first. Yeah. That's the 5-to-1 rule. And it's super hard to do. And so it'll be like, she picked me up late again. I'm going to, okay. But first, I got to tell you, you look so beautiful tonight. And I really appreciate the fact that you had dinner for me last night because I was coming home late, and I love your mother. Forget that one. Anyway, so it's like, and by the time they get through the 5, he finds that they forgot number 6. They forgot the 1. Okay, so here's the point, and you made the point, and it's really smart, Jared. We do that in social media. We change us, and we change social media. Yeah. But it really starts in our own hearts because you basically say, I'm not going to say anything snarky, nothing sarcastic, nothing negative. Nothing. I don't care how clever my riposte is. Yeah. I don't care. I'm going to say 5 positive, beautiful things before I get to that. You'll change yourself and you probably won't get to the 6th thing. The 5-to-1 rule will change every single one of us. It has completely changed me on social media.
Well, one thing, too, that I think that this really speaks to is the need to understand the individual versus the individual's ideas. So often we tie the person's ideas, and we have perhaps contempt or anger for that idea. So we start
Right.
attacking the individual, and we go after that person's dignity itself when we do that.
No, it's a big weapon. It's like it's going nuclear effectively. But to not be able to separate somebody from their opinions is incredibly emotionally immature. Mm-hmm. I mean, to say that, Jared is his political views is insane. I mean, that's craziness. I mean, no matter how wrong I think your political views are, you're my brother.
Right.
And one of the things that parents always teach their kids is some version of the lesson that people are not what they say. People are not even what they think. They're people. Yeah. And people have equal dignity. And all of us, almost all of us, we actually believe that equal dignity, but we treat people with less dignity when we fail to separate them from their views. So next time you're having a bitter reaction to something that somebody says, say, I am reacting poorly not to that person, but what that person just said, and perhaps what that person thinks. And it has an amazing tonic impact. It really changes the way that you react when you remember that.
All right, and we're back after that interview with Jared and Dr. Arthur Brooks. So as Jared pointed out in the first segment of today's episode, Dr. Brooks has written a number of books, but this one here, Love Your Enemies, goes into that issue of the culture of contempt, which Jared discusses with him in the interview. And so, Jared, let's pass it back over to you. What really stood out to you in that conversation about the culture of contempt?
Yeah, I think, and of course, he mentions this in the book as well, is that whenever we kind of mentioned this in the last episode of this problem of a culture of contempt. He calls contempt almost more dangerous than anger, because at least in anger, you still want the good of the other. Mm-hmm. You have a righteous anger, and something's not right, and I want to fix it. Contempt means something's not right, and I don't care.
It's like an indifference.
Exactly. It's kind of a meh, who cares type of thing. And there's more, he says it's less about name calling and more about eye rolling, mm-hmm. So it's a contemptuous behavior. But what I love that he offers several different, and I would highly recommend picking up his book, but he offers several different points on the way in which we can operate inside of this culture of contempt. And part of what we keep talking about, this third way, is this type of understanding of saying, for example, one thing that he says is, whenever someone attacks, for example, say the liberal left, or somebody attacks the conservative right, or et cetera, he knows people on all spheres. I think we all do. We all have somebody in our life that operates in these other ideologies. And what we always have to consider is, well, wait, you're talking about my mother, or wait, you're talking about my cousin. We have to think about the fact that we're in this as humanity together. This whole idea of us versus them becomes very, to bring up Rene Girard as we do constantly at Word on Fire, but it turns into this scapegoating mechanism where all of a sudden they're the problems of society and we have the ways to fix it. But the way he offers is always thinking through a personification of the individual and thinking of them as an individual loved, and so the way that we operate is loving that person. And so it's able to separate the ideology or the ideas from the person themselves. Yeah. And so you're operating on, again, from the heart.
And it goes back to the metaphysics we talked about before, the metaphysics of the human person. So you start by saying, what is it? It's a human person. Mm-hmm. Then you say, who is it? And then by asking that question, you're asking, what's their relationship to me? You talked about how we could, you potentially, depending on who you're talking about, say, that's my mother or that's my brother. And something that the Judeo-Christian worldview offers is this way of seeing all of humanity as brothers and sisters, that we've all been created by the same God and been given the same godlike dignity from our Creator. And so when that's the way you see the world, then when you say, what is it? It's a human person. You say, who is it? No matter who it is, no matter what they've done to you or somebody you love, you always have the obligation, because if we're supposed to be speaking the truth, and it's true that everybody is your brother and sister according to the creation of God, then the answer to the question, who is it, is that's my brother, that's my sister. And then that then determines how you ought to act towards them. Absolutely. So it's a challenge. It's not easy. It's easy for us to sit here with our heads in the clouds and talk about how this is how we ought to be. And we both know that in real life, it's
hard.
It's a lot harder than maybe we make it sound like. But I think, again, I see these things often through a more philosophical worldview because that's just where my interests are and just the way I tend to see things. But again, caused me to lament a little bit this sort of disregard in the modern culture for metaphysics and for going back to the deepest and most foundational questions about reality. What is it? Yeah. Who is this? How ought I act according to natural law? Yeah. And then, one step further is how ought I act according to divine revelation, if you believe in that sort of thing.
And what I love, too, is whenever he talks about economics and politics and these other things as tools to an end, they're not an end themselves. And I think so often we end up tying politics and economics to the end. That is the end. And again, it's a false metaphysics of the human person that causes that kind of thing. But if you consider these things as tools, well, you can disagree all day on how to use a tool. There perhaps is one proper way, to hit a hammer, right? But you can disagree on numerous different matters. Especially politics and economics is such a broad, big subject. But within there's still what you might call the marketplace of ideas. It's able to disagree, agree. We can kind of figure out what's going on, maybe come to a synthesis. If not, we continue to kind of work this thing through. But you still love the individual throughout it. And what I love about Dr. Brooks as well is that, oftentimes on the two sides of the spectrum, you have a lot of loud and anger or angry voices on both sides. And then you got Dr. Brooks and people like him coming through with this just passionate call back to human dignity and love. And so I love that, this guy's, he's worked with the Dalai Lama. He's worked with, some of the, highest up, both spiritual
in D.C. with his think tank. He's worked with many of the biggest influencers
presidents
in politics
and politicians and et cetera. He even does a really good job of, he says politicians get a bad rap, but he's like, these people are my friends and I know them really well and they're actually very passionate about helping the country, So I think it just gives us a better perspective, especially during this time in our country in the United States where there is a problem of contemptuous behavior where we're just yelling at each other. And so he's able to kind of bring this third way in a real way.
I would not want to be the person writing the book called Love Your Enemies, especially if you're a public figure. People know who you are and they watch how you behave around other people. Because he's touching on something darn near impossible given the fallen human nature, loving your enemies. And yet, the way that he articulates his position and how he understands this, and in the book, he goes so much more in depth about what it means to love your enemies. And I think in a culturally relevant way, even for the person who's not interested in economics at all. We're all actually interested in economics. Sure, yeah, it's kind of like saying, oh, I'm not interested in philosophy. Actually, yes, you are, because even to make that conclusion, you've had to, in some way, make some philosophical argumentation in order to convince yourself of that. So everything that he writes in this book is in one way or another relevant to anyone who reads it. But more so, I think the interview he did with you and the longer interview that's going to be available in the journal, I think did a really good job, for me at least, being somebody who's not typically someone who gravitates towards discussions on economics. I think he made it actually very interesting and engaging for me. So was there any new insights that you gained out of this conversation that in some way you've been able to apply to your personal life?
It's more of just a mindset of being how to understand what's going on. When you scroll through social media now, it's constantly one side or the other that's the loudest voices. And so this allows for a much more balanced perspective of being able to see this. It also kind of opened my eyes to maybe my own personal biases and how maybe I'm operating in some way in judging one side or the other and not doing. And I think, especially as you mentioned, love your enemies, right? That there's such a radicality to the Christian thing that even now that shocks us. Right? Yeah. Even now, that idea still kind of goes, wait, what? That's not the natural thing. And so it definitely opened up my eyes. And that's why I kind of say that he's been a hero of mine, because he's been able to articulate something that I personally cannot articulate as well as he can, especially when it comes to economics, politics, et cetera. But I'm really excited because actually later this week, you and I will be with Dr. Arthur Brooks out in Santa Barbara. And so actually on November 21st at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we will have a live-streamed event with Dr. Arthur Brooks. This is the second of the Bishop Barron Presents events that we've done. You remember last year we had Leah Labresco, Sergeant, and so now we've got Dr. Arthur Brooks coming to Santa Barbara. And so be sure to keep an eye out for that. Again, it's on November 21st at 7 p.m. Pacific. And so we'll actually have a live-streamed presentation by Dr. Brooks. And then after that, we'll have a little intermission, and then there's actually going to be an exclusive discussion between Bishop Barron and Dr. Brooks. I'll be hosting that discussion. This will be exclusively for Institute members. And so if you want to partake in that, and you want to get the journal that includes the rest of the interview with Dr. Brooks, be sure to sign up for the Institute. So if you go to wordonfire.institute, you can join. And of course, we've got numerous courses. Right now, we're still going through Bishop Barron's John Henry Newman course. And we will continue to provide the best content that we can. And so again, this is just a quick invitation to go ahead and join now, because later this week, if you want to partake in that exclusive discussion, you'll have to be part of the Institute. So Matt, any final thoughts?
No final thoughts, sir.
All right. Well, this is a great show, and let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe on both YouTube and iTunes, and y'all have a great rest of your day.